Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack the history of social movements, really digging into how ordinary people have organized themselves to demand some pretty extraordinary changes over the last century or so. So, what could possibly connect a teenage girl in Arkansas to a top nuclear scientist in Moscow? Well, on the surface, almost nothing. But they were both actually key figures in powerful social movements that literally reshaped our world. And their stories, even though they're separated by thousands of miles and totally different political systems, they show us this shared, deep-down human desire for dignity, for justice, and for change. All right, let's get into it.
To really get a grip on these movements, we've got to rewind to the middle of the 20th century. After the chaos of World War II, the world was entering this brand new era. For many, it was a time of economic boom, but it was also a time of really deep injustices and simmering tensions. This created the perfect, fertile ground for people to finally stand up and demand their rights.
So what exactly is a social movement? Well, at its heart, it's a collective, organized effort. It's what happens when huge groups of people feel like the system just isn't working for them anymore. So they band together to either push for a change they want or to resist a change they don't. It's really the voice of the people put into action.
Okay, so this global push for change really sparked these intense fights for the most basic human rights you can imagine. And these struggles, they looked completely different in the world's two big superpowers at the time, the United States and the Soviet Union.
In the US, the big fight was against racial segregation. And this picture, wow, it just captures the raw courage that took. This is Elizabeth Eckford, just a teenager trying to walk into a newly desegregated school, and she's facing down a mob. This one single image tells you so much about the intense, personal bravery that was at the very heart of the American civil rights movement.
And that bravery wasn't just a one-off thing. It was channeled into a super organized, really strategic movement. Activists had this powerful toolkit of nonviolent tactics, things like boycotts, which created economic pressure, and civil disobedience, which created moral pressure, by peacefully showing everyone just how brutal an unjust system could be. These weren't just random protests. They were sophisticated, well-thought-out campaigns.
And all of that strategy led to these incredible moments, like the 1963 March on Washington. You had more than 200,000 people there to hear Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. give his historic I Have a Dream speech. He wasn't just asking for new laws. He was painting this powerful, moral picture of what America could be and what it should be. Now, what's so fascinating here is the contrast. While Americans were fighting to make their democracy actually live up to its own promises, a totally different struggle was going on in the Soviet Union. Activists there, like the nuclear scientist Andrei Sakharov, weren't fighting for equal rights within the system. No, they were fighting for the very existence of rights that the authoritarian system completely denied. Basic stuff like freedom of speech and the press. So, as the Cold War between these two superpowers got more and more intense, a whole new kind of social movement started to bubble up. You had citizens on both sides, and really all around the world, starting to push back not just against problems at home, but against the whole machinery of war itself. The Vietnam War was a huge catalyst for this, and the human cost. It was just staggering. We're talking up to 3 million Vietnamese military and civilian deaths. And for the first time, the awful reality of war was being beamed into people's living rooms on TV every night. That sent shockwaves across the world, especially inside the United States. People started to seriously question if the war was right or wrong, and they used a lot of the same nonviolent protest tactics they'd learned during the civil rights movement. This led to massive protests and a really powerful draft resistance movement. Young Americans started publicly declaring, "We won't go," which turned what could have been a personal choice into a massive political statement that in the end helped force the US government to pull out.
The success of the anti-war movement really fueled an even bigger peace movement. This one focused on the ultimate threat, nuclear weapons. I mean, that fear started with Hiroshima, but it just got worse and worse during the Cold War arms race. And then, the Chernobyl disaster in 1986 made that danger feel terrifyingly real for everyone, kind of merging anti-war and environmental worries. All that public pressure was a huge reason why we got historic arms reduction treaties like START.
Right, so the threat of nuclear fallout was really part of this bigger, growing awareness that, hey, what we're doing as humans is having a seriously dangerous impact on the planet. People started to question the whole idea of progress, which gave rise to what we now know as modern environmentalism.
This table gives you a really great snapshot of just how diverse these environmental movements were. I mean, on one hand, you've got these global groups like Greenpeace, which actually came out of anti-nuclear protests. But on the other hand, you have these powerful grassroots struggles happening in places like India, often led by women, fighting to protect their own communities from destructive development projects.
So the really important idea that came out of all of these movements was this new concept, sustainable development. It's the idea that real progress can't happen if it destroys the environment, and it can't happen on the backs of marginalized communities. Real development has to be good for the planet and fair for all people.
The fight for justice in Bhopal, India, after that absolutely horrific gas leak in 1984 is such a powerful example of this. You look at the movement's demands here. They weren't just about cleaning up a mess. They were about fundamental human rights, the right to health care, the right to be compensated fairly, and the right to hold these huge corporations accountable. And that struggle, believe it or not, is still going on today. That fight for accountability in places like Bhopal, it almost always relies on the people most affected organizing at the local level. And as we've kind of touched on already, across all of these different movements, we see one group again and again on the front lines of that community organizing: women. Just listen to this powerful quote from the anti-Iraq movement in India. These women saw firsthand how alcoholism was tearing their families apart. So what did they do? They organized. They used the literacy classes they were taking as a way to build networks and share their stories. And that sense of empowerment led to this massive and ultimately successful campaign to ban the sale of that liquor. And you see a similar story in Manipur with a women's movement called the Mera Payabi, which means torchbearers. It actually started as a local patrol against alcohol abuse, but it morphed into this incredible human rights movement. We're talking about ordinary women armed with nothing but kerosene torches, patrolling the streets at night to protect their communities from military abuses. They became this amazing symbol of nonviolent resistance. So, what's the thread that ties all of these stories together? The civil rights activist, the anti-war protester, the environmentalist, the torch-bearing mother in Manipur. What can we take away from this incredible century of protest and social movements? This slide really just nails it. Social movements are driven by regular people, not by political elites. They bring together all sorts of different people around one big, powerful idea. They tend to be democratic and participatory, and they almost always happen when people feel like the political system has just stopped listening to them. At their core, every single one is raising these huge questions about human rights, about dignity, and about equality. The fight for a world that's more just, more equal, and more sustainable is, well, it's clearly an unfinished struggle. The methods might change, the specific causes might evolve, but that fundamental human drive for change is always there. And that leaves us with one last thing to think about. We've seen how the movements of the past completely reshaped their world. So the question for us is, what movements are reshaping ours right now?